The city of Los Angeles shimmered below like a sea of broken stars, its lights flickering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment. Emma stood there, barefoot on the cool hardwood floor, her reflection a ghost in the glass. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the diffuser on the shelf, but it couldn't mask the metallic tang of adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. Her dark hair clung to her neck, damp with sweat, not from the warm March night, but from what she'd just done. 30 minutes ago, she'd been in Tom's car, his hands on her skin, his breath hot against her ear. Now, she was here, staring out at the sprawl of Hollywood Boulevard, waiting for the sound she knew was coming. The front door clicked open behind her. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The familiar rhythm of James's footsteps, James, who everyone called Jake, echoed through the open-plan living space. A clink of glass on the marble countertop told her he'd poured himself a drink. Bourbon, probably. He always reached for bourbon when the day had worn him thin. She could picture him without looking, tall, broad-shouldered, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar after a long day sketching blueprints for some sleek new downtown high-rise. His hazel eyes would be sharp, scanning her even now. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice low, almost playful. It sliced through the silence like a blade. She felt it in her chest, a tightening she couldn't shake. He stepped closer. She heard the soft scuff of his shoes on the rug, and stopped just behind her. Close enough that she could smell the faint cedar of his cologne, close enough that she wondered if he could smell Tom on her. Emma forced a smile, turning her head just enough to catch his reflection in the window. "Long day," she lied. Her voice came out steady, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She pressed her palms against the cold glass, grounding herself. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red, a dizzying kaleidoscope that mirrored the chaos in her mind. Jake tilted his head, studying her. She could feel his gaze like a weight, pressing into her spine. He took a sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly, then set the glass down on the side table with a deliberate thud. "Long day," he echoed, and there it was, that edge in his tone, the one she'd learned to recognize over 7 years of marriage. Not anger, not yet. Curiosity, maybe, or something darker. He stepped closer, his reflection looming larger in the glass. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I was thinking about you today." He paused, letting the words hang there, heavy as the humid air rolling in from the Pacific. "Wondering where you were, what you were up to." Her stomach twisted. She turned fully now, meeting his eyes. They were steady, unblinking, the kind of look that could peel back layers of skin and bone to see what hid underneath. His lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach those eyes. "You didn't text me back," he added, almost casually. Too casually. "I was busy," she said too quickly. Her throat felt dry, her tongue clumsy. She crossed her arms, a shield against whatever was coming. The room felt smaller now, the walls of sleek white plaster and modern art closing in. The hum of the city outside was a distant roar, drowned by the thudding of her own pulse. Jake nodded, slow and deliberate. Then he leaned in, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. "You wouldn't do it, though, would you?" he murmured. His smile widened, showing teeth. "You wouldn't step out on me." Her heart stopped. For one endless second, the world held its breath. The lights outside froze, the air thickened, her lungs burned. She forced a laugh, sharp and brittle, and stepped back, her heel brushing the edge of the rug. "What are you talking about?" she said, but the words sounded hollow, even to her. He didn't answer. He just held her gaze, that smile still playing on his lips, then turned and walked toward the hallway, his footsteps fading into the dark. The bourbon glass sat abandoned on the table, condensation pooling around its base like tears. Emma stood alone again, her reflection staring back at her from the glass, fractured by the city lights. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the wild beat beneath her ribs, and wondered, did he know? The morning sun sliced through the blinds of the penthouse, casting sharp lines of light across the kitchen island. Emma stood there, barefoot again, her fingers curled around a steaming mug of coffee. The rich, bitter scent filled the air, but it did little to steady her nerves. She hadn't slept. Jake's words from last night, "You wouldn't do it, would you?" looped in her mind like a broken record, each repetition tightening the knot in her chest. The city outside buzzed faintly, a dull hum of traffic rising from Sunset Boulevard, but inside, the silence was suffocating. Jake appeared in the doorway, his hair still damp from the shower, a towel slung over his shoulder. He wore a gray t-shirt and jeans, casual in a way that made him look too relaxed, too normal. It unnerved her. She watched him move to the fridge, the muscles in his back shifting under the fabric, and wondered how someone so familiar could feel like a stranger now. He pulled out a carton of orange juice, poured it into a glass, and took a slow sip, his eyes flicking to her over the rim. "You're up early," he said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. His tone was light, but there was that edge again, lurking beneath the surface. She hated how he could do that, sound like everything was fine while planting seeds of doubt. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, keeping her voice even. She took a sip of coffee, the heat stinging her lips, and leaned against the counter. The marble was cold against her hip, grounding her. She needed that. Her mind was still tangled in last night. Tom's hands, the leather scent of his car, the guilt that had chased her home. And now Jake, standing there, watching her like he could see it all. He nodded, crossing his arms. "Me neither." A pause, heavy and deliberate. Then he smiled, a slow, easy grin that didn't match the sharpness in his eyes. "I was thinking, maybe we've gotten too comfortable. Too predictable." Emma's grip tightened on the mug. "What do you mean?" she asked, though part of her already knew where this was going. The air shifted, charged with something she couldn't name. Jake stepped closer, resting his hands on the island between them. The kitchen felt smaller now, the sleek stainless steel appliances and polished surfaces closing in like a cage. "I mean us," he said, his voice low. "Our marriage. Maybe we should shake things up. Open it a little." He tilted his head, watching her reaction. "What do you think?" Her breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Relief flooded her, sweet, sharp, and dangerous. He was handing her an out, a way to bury her secret under a new rule. She could keep seeing Tom, and it wouldn't be betrayal anymore. But then came the suspicion, cold and creeping. Why now? Did he know? Was this a trap? She forced a smile, mirroring his, and set her mug down with a soft clatter. "Open it," she echoed, testing the words. "You mean, see other people?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging like it was nothing. "Why not? We're adults. We can handle it." He picked up his juice again, took another sip, and washed her over the glass. "Unless you're not up for it." The challenge hung there, daring her to flinch. She didn't. "I could handle it," she said, her voice steady now. "Could you?" His smile widened, but it was tight, almost brittle. "Oh, I think I'll manage." He turned to grab his keys from the hook by the door, the jangle of metal cutting through the tension. "I've got a meeting downtown. Think about it, okay?" And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Emma stood alone in the kitchen, the coffee cooling in her hands. She should have felt free. His suggestion was permission, wasn't it? But instead, her stomach churned. She crossed to the sink, dumped the coffee down the drain, and watched the dark liquid swirl away. Then she pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over Tom's name. She didn't text him. Not yet. Instead, she opened Jake's calendar app. He'd synced it to hers years ago. There it was, meeting, 10 a.m., downtown. She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. He'd never mentioned a meeting last night. She grabbed her own keys and headed for the door, the city's hum growing louder as she stepped into the elevator. If he could play this game, so could she. She just needed to know what he was hiding. The midday sun glared off the asphalt of Melrose Avenue, turning the street into a shimmering mirage. Emma sat in her car, parked across from a sleek glass-fronted cafe, her sunglasses perched on her nose. The air conditioning hummed, a faint relief against the heat seeping through the windows, but it couldn't cool the fire in her chest. She'd followed Jake here, trailing his black SUV through the snarl of LA traffic, her hands tight on the wheel. His meeting wasn't at some downtown office. It was here, in this trendy spot with its outdoor tables and overpriced lattes. And he wasn't alone. Through the cafe window, she could see him. Jake leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, one arm draped over the backrest. Across from him sat a woman, blonde, mid-30s, her laugh carrying faintly through the glass. She wore a red dress that hugged her frame, bold against the muted tones of the cafe. Emma's stomach twisted. She couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. The way Jake tilted his head, the way his fingers tapped the table, it was a dance she knew too well. He was flirting. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, snapping her out of the haze. A text from Tom. Lunch today? Miss you already. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering, guilt and anger tangling in her throat. She'd met Tom just an hour ago, in his cramped office downtown, the blinds drawn against prying eyes. His hands had been on her again, his voice low and urgent, promising things she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. She'd left feeling hollow, the thrill souring into something heavier. And now here she was, spying on her husband, while her lover texted her like nothing had changed. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned her attention back to Jake. The woman touched his arm, a fleeting gesture, and he didn't pull away. Emma's nails dug into her palms. Was this what he meant by opening their marriage? Had he already started? Or was this just a game to push her, to see how far she'd bend before she broke? She hated how the questions gnawed at her, hated how she couldn't trust the man she'd shared a bed with for years. Back at the penthouse, the afternoon dragged on. Emma paced the living room, the city sprawling beyond the windows like a taunting reminder of her unraveling life. She'd poured herself a glass of wine. White, crisp, too early in the day, but it sat untouched on the coffee table, the condensation leaving a ring on the wood. Her phone lay beside it, unlocked, a reckless decision. She'd left it there when she showered, and now Jake was home, sprawled on the couch with his laptop, his tie loosened around his neck. He glanced up, catching her eye. "You okay?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. "You look distracted." "I'm fine," she said, too sharp. She crossed to the window, turning her back to him, her reflection a pale shadow against the glass. The Hollywood sign loomed in the distance, a silent witness to their crumbling facade. She heard him shift, the creak of the couch, and then his footsteps. He was behind her again, like last night, his presence a weight she couldn't shake. "Busy day?" he asked, and there it was, that probing tone, fishing for something. She didn't answer, just watched his reflection as he picked up her phone from the table. Her breath hitched. The screen was still on, Tom's text glowing bright. Jake's eyes flicked to it, and for a heartbeat, she thought he'd call her out. But he didn't. He just smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips, and set the phone back down. "Looks like you've been in demand," he said, his voice light, almost teasing. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her shoulder as he leaned in. "Good for you." Then he walked away, leaving her frozen, the wine glass trembling in her hand when she finally picked it up. She didn't drink it. She dumped it down the sink, the liquid splashing against the steel, and grabbed her keys again. She needed air, answers, something. The elevator ride down was a blur, the city's heat hitting her like a slap as she stepped outside. Jake knew. He had to. And now she needed to know what he was hiding. The game was on, and she wasn't sure who was winning. The evening sky over Los Angeles burned orange, the kind of sunset that painted the city in a deceptive glow. Emma drove home through the tangle of traffic on Wilshire Boulevard, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The day had been a blur, another stolen hour with Tom, his lips on hers in the dim light of his apartment, followed by a gnawing unease she couldn't shake. Jake's smile from earlier, that knowing glint in his eyes, haunted her. She needed to confront him, to lay the cards on the table and see what he'd play. The penthouse loomed ahead as she pulled into the garage, its glass facade reflecting the dying light like a mirror to her fractured life. She stepped out of the elevator, keys jingling in her hand, and froze. The door to their apartment was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. Music drifted out, something low and jazzy, the kind Jake liked when he was unwinding. But there was another sound, softer, unmistakable, a woman's laugh. Emma's stomach dropped. She pushed the door open, her breath shallow, and stepped inside. The living room was bathed in the warm glow of the floor lamps, the city twinkling beyond the windows. Jake sat on the couch, his arms stretched along the backrest, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Across from him, perched on the edge of an armchair, was the woman from the cafe, the blonde in the red dress. She looked up as Emma entered, her smile faltering for a split second before settling into something polite, practiced. Jake didn't flinch. He just turned his head, his hazel eyes locking onto hers, and smiled. "You're home," he said, his voice calm, almost warm. "Good timing." Emma's throat tightened. She dropped her bag by the door, the thud echoing in the sudden silence. "What's this?" she asked, her words sharp, cutting through the jazz. Her eyes flicked between them, the woman's manicured nails tapping her wine glass. Jake's casual sprawl, the way the air felt thick with something unspoken. Jake set his drink down, the ice clinking softly. "This is Lauren," he said, gesturing to the woman. "She's a friend. We were just catching up." Lauren nodded, her smile tight, but Emma barely registered her. Her focus was on Jake, on the way he leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Caught up yet?" Emma snapped, crossing her arms. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the music. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but then Jake stood, slow and deliberate, and the room shrank around her. "Sit down, Em," he said, his tone shifting, lower, firmer. She didn't move, but he didn't wait. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath. "I know about Tom." The world tilted. Her legs felt weak, but she held her ground, her nails digging into her palms. "What?" she whispered, the word barely audible. Jake's smile returned, slow and cold. "I know about Tom," he repeated. "I've known for weeks. And you know what?" He paused, letting the silence stretch, his eyes boring into hers. "It was my idea." Her breath stopped. The room spun, the sleek furniture, the city lights, Lauren's wide-eyed stare, all of it blurred. "What are you talking about?" she managed, her voice trembling. "I sent him to you," Jake said, his words a knife. "Tom, I told him to get close, to see if you'd bite. And you did." He laughed, a short, bitter sound, and stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "I wanted to test you, Em, to see how far you'd go." Emma stared at him, her mind racing, pieces snapping into place. Tom's sudden interest, the late-night texts, the way he'd pushed her boundaries. It hadn't been chance. It had been Jake, her husband. Her chest burned, rage and betrayal clawing their way up her throat. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, but Emma barely noticed. Her eyes were on Jake, on the man she thought she knew. "You're sick," she spat, her voice breaking. She turned to leave, to escape the suffocating weight of his confession, but he grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "Don't walk away," he said, his smile gone. "We're not done." She yanked free, her heart pounding, and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. The elevator hummed as she descended, her reflection in the mirrored walls a stranger, pale, wild-eyed, furious. Jake had played her, but now she'd play back. The Los Angeles night pressed against the windows of Tom's apartment, a blanket of smog and neon blurring the skyline. Emma stood in his living room, her arms crossed, her reflection a faint smear in the glass. The space was cramped compared to the penthouse, low ceilings, mismatched furniture, a faint smell of takeout lingering in the air. Tom sat on the couch, his shirt unbuttoned, a beer in his hand. He watched her pace, his dark eyes tracking her like a predator sizing up prey. She'd come here straight from Jake's confession, her mind a storm of fury and betrayal. If Jake wanted to play her, she'd play harder. "You're quiet tonight," Tom said, his voice smooth, too smooth. He took a sip of his beer, the bottle clinking against the coffee table as he set it down. "Everything okay?" Emma stopped pacing, turning to face him. Her pulse thudded in her temples, a drumbeat of rage. "Did you know?" she asked, her words sharp, slicing through the hum of the city outside. "Did Jake put you up to this?" Tom's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. She saw it, the flicker of guilt, the crack in his easy charm. He leaned back, spreading his arms along the couch. "What are you talking about?" he said, but his tone was off, too casual, too rehearsed. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, stepping closer. The hardwood creaked under her boots, the sound harsh in the small space. "He told me everything. How he sent you. How this," she gestured between them, her hand trembling, "was his idea." Tom's jaw tightened. He set the beer down, slow and deliberate, and stood, closing the distance between them. He was taller than her, his presence filling the room, but she didn't back down. "Em," he said, his voice low, "it wasn't like that. Not at first. Not at first." She laughed, a brittle, broken sound. "So what? You just went along with it? Seduced me for him?" Her chest heaved, the air thick with the scent of his cologne, something cheap, musky, a stark contrast to Jake's cedar. She hated how it clung to her now. Tom reached for her arm, but she jerked away. It started as a favor, he admitted, his eyes darting away, then back to hers. Jake asked me to test you. But then it got real. I didn't expect to. He stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't expect you. Her stomach churned. Real? She wanted to believe him, to cling to the idea that something here was hers, not Jake's. But the doubt gnawed at her, relentless. She turned away, staring out at the city lights, their flicker mocking her. I don't care, she lied, her voice steady now. I'm done being his pawn. And yours. Back at the penthouse, the air was electric. Jake was in the kitchen when she walked in, chopping vegetables with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The knife flashed under the recessed lights, each slice a sharp thwack against the cutting board. He didn't look up, but she knew he'd heard her come in. The tension in his shoulders gave him away. You're back, he said, his voice flat. He slid the carrots into a pan, the sizzle of oil filling the silence. Thought you'd be out longer. Emma dropped her keys on the counter, the jangle loud and deliberate. I'm done running, she said, stepping closer. But I'm not done with you. He stopped chopping, the knife hovering midair. When he turned, his eyes were dark, unreadable. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. But there was a crack in his calm, a tremor she hadn't heard before. It means I know your game, she said, her voice rising, raw and jagged. You pushed me to Tom, and now you're pretending it's fine? You're not fine, Jake. You're breaking. His face twisted. Anger, guilt, something deeper, and he slammed the knife down, the blade embedding in the board. You think you're the only one who gets to feel betrayed? He shouted, his control shattering. You went for it, Em. You didn't even hesitate. She flinched, but held his gaze, her own fury boiling over. Because you made me, she yelled back. You wanted this, and now you can't handle it. The silence that followed was deafening, the city's hum a distant whisper. They stood there, breathing hard, masks gone, the truth laid bare between them. The game had broken them both. Rain streaked the windows of the penthouse, a rare March downpour turning Los Angeles into a glistening blur. The city lights bled through the glass, casting jagged shadows across the living room floor. Emma stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, the damp chill seeping into her skin. She hadn't moved since their fight hours ago, when Jake's shout had echoed off the walls and her own voice had cracked under the weight of her anger. The silence now was worse, thick, oppressive, a void swallowing every sound but the steady patter of rain. Jake was in the bedroom. She'd heard him pacing earlier, the creak of the floorboards a restless rhythm, but now it was quiet. Too quiet. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, the screen lighting up with Tom's name. She didn't pick it up. She couldn't face him, not after his confession, not with Jake's words still burning in her ears. You didn't even hesitate. The accusation stung because it was true. She'd leapt at the chance, at Tom, at something that wasn't this suffocating marriage. And now they were all drowning in it. The bedroom door opened, and Jake stepped out. He looked wrecked, hair mussed, shirt untucked, a smear of blood on his knuckles. Her breath caught. He stopped by the glass dining table, his eyes fixed on her, dark and hollow. I hit something, he said, his voice rough, answering the question she hadn't asked. He flexed his hand, wincing, and she noticed the shattered remains of a whiskey glass on the floor near the couch. Shards glinted in the dim light, sharp as the truth between them. What are we doing, Jake? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The rain drummed harder, a relentless beat against the silence. She turned to face him fully, her reflection a ghost in the wet glass behind her. This game, it's killing us. He laughed, a low, bitter sound that made her skin crawl. You think I don't know that? He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the broken glass. I started it, Em. I pushed you. And now I can't. He stopped, his jaw clenching, his hands balling into fists. I can't stop seeing it. You with him. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream that he'd made her do it, that he'd set the trap, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched him unravel, the man who'd always been so controlled now fraying at the edges. Then why? She asked, her voice breaking. Why did you do it? He didn't answer right away. He crossed to the window, standing beside her, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. The city sprawled below, a chaotic sprawl of lights and shadows, mirroring the mess they'd made. Because I needed to know, he said finally, his voice raw. I needed to know if you still wanted me. If I was enough. The confession hit her like a punch. She stared at him, rain streaking the glass like tears, and felt the weight of it settle in her bones. He'd tested her because he was afraid of losing her, afraid of what they'd become. And she'd failed him. Or had he failed her? The lines were too blurred now. She turned away, her throat burning, and grabbed her coat from the rack. I can't do this tonight, she said, her voice trembling. She needed air, space, anything but this suffocating room. He didn't stop her as she stepped into the hall, the elevator doors sliding shut behind her with a soft ding. The rain hit her like a slap as she stepped outside, soaking her hair, her clothes, her skin. She didn't care. She walked, the neon signs of Hollywood Boulevard flickering through the downpour, until she reached Tom's car idling at a corner. He rolled down the window, his face shadowed, concern etched in his eyes. Get in, he said, but she didn't move. She just stood there, drenched, staring at him, at the man Jake had sent to break her. Back in the penthouse, Jake sank to the floor, his back against the window, blood dripping from his hand onto the hardwood. The rain pounded on, a relentless witness to their fall. They were at the edge now, and neither knew how to step back. The rain had stopped, leaving Los Angeles slick and silent under a sky bruised with clouds. Emma sat at the kitchen island in the penthouse, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea she hadn't touched. The apartment was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and regret. She'd come back after standing in the storm, after staring into Tom's eyes and seeing nothing she could hold on to. Her coat hung by the door, dripping onto the hardwood, a puddle spreading like the mess of their lives. The city lights flickered beyond the windows, faint and distant, as if they too were tired of watching. Jake emerged from the bedroom, his steps slow, deliberate. The blood on his knuckles had dried, a dark stain against his skin, and his eyes were red-rimmed, hollow. He didn't speak at first, just leaned against the counter across from her, his arms crossed. The silence stretched, a fragile thread pulled taut between them. She could hear his breathing, uneven and shallow, and it matched the unsteady rhythm of her own heart. They'd screamed, they'd shattered, and now there was nothing left but this quiet, aching void. I saw him, she said finally, her voice low, cutting through the stillness. She didn't look up, just stared at the tea, the faint steam long gone. Tom. He was waiting for me out there. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. And, he asked, his tone flat, like he was bracing for a blow he'd already felt. And I didn't go with him, she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. They were dark, searching, but she found no answers there, just the same exhaustion she felt. I couldn't. Not after. She trailed off, the words too heavy to finish. After everything. After his confession, his game, her betrayal. After the truth had stripped them bare. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and looked away, out at the city. The Hollywood sign glowed faintly in the distance, a mocking beacon of dreams neither of them could claim anymore. I thought it'd fix us, he said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Pushing you. Seeing if you'd stay. I thought it'd make me feel something. Did it? She asked, her throat tight. She wanted him to say no, to admit it had all been a mistake, but she knew better. She'd felt it too, the rush, the pain, the twisted thrill of their dance. He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the marble. Yeah, it made me hate myself. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. And you. The words landed like a stone in her chest, heavy and cold. She should have felt anger or sadness, but there was nothing, just a dull ache where something vital used to be. I loved you, she said, the past tense slipping out before she could stop it. It hung there, fragile and final, and she saw it hit him, saw the flinch in his shoulders. I loved you too, he replied, his voice breaking on the last word. He stepped closer, stopping just short of the island, his hands hovering like he wanted to reach for her, but didn't know how. Where does that leave us? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the window. The city stared back, its lights dimming as the clouds thickened, a slow fade into darkness. Jake joined her, standing beside her, their reflections side by side in the glass, two strangers wearing familiar faces. The silence returned, softer now, less hostile, but no less empty. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time didn't matter anymore. The tea sat forgotten, the puddle by the door spread wider, and the city lights blinked out one by one. Neither of them moved, neither spoke. There was no winner in this game, no resolution, just the quiet wreckage of what they'd been. And as the last light faded, leaving only shadows on the glass, they stood there, together and apart, letting the darkness take what was left.